Good afternoon and welcome to the GIGAEurope EU Presidency event, Connectivity for a Gigabit Europe. My name is Irina Vărlan. I am the Managing Director of GIGAEurope, a trade association that brings together private operators who build, operate, and invest in gigabit networks that enable Europe's digital connectivity. I am pleased to see how this event brings together a variety of actors within the digital ecosystem, policymakers, alongside industry representatives and civil society. I am very happy to meet you all today, even if still virtually. We meet some of you again and some of you for the first time, but I'm really hopeful that we will be able to meet in person soon as Europe is turning the tide of the COVID-19 pandemic. The rotating EU presidency provides fresh ideas and new priorities to Europe's digital agenda. As GIGAEurope, we find it important to engage in a dialogue with the EU presidency and work together to build Europe's gigabit society and make Europe a digital leader. Today's webinar is the first of a series that will focus on each presidency of the EU Council, inviting them to share their views and priorities on the EU digital agenda and have an open dialogue. Over the past decade, connectivity providers have continued to invest in network rollout and innovations to allow for ubiquitous fixed mobile access, faster speeds, lower latency. To close the investment gap, Europe needs a mix of public funds and private investment in the coming years. Policies will have to provide incentives for private infrastructure investment in order for the Digital Compass 2030 targets to be met. I am deeply honored and grateful to welcome our most distinguished guests. Our keynote speaker, Mr. Hugo Santos Mendes, Deputy Minister for Communications, Portugal, and our speakers for the panel, which will be moderated by Samuel Stolton, EU Tech Correspondent, Rita Wezenbeek, Director Connectivity, DigiConnect, European Commission, Erzsebet Fitori, Group Head of EU Affairs and Relations, Vodafone Group, and Robert Kolthek, Vice President Regulation, Liberty Global. Ladies and gentlemen, I am very excited about GIGAEurope's role in making this decade Europe's digital decade. We will do so by putting forward the connectivity perspective into Europe's digital policy agenda and by engaging in open discussions and rich exchanges with all stakeholders within the digital ecosystem. Today, together, we will be successful in investing and innovating in a digital, green, and resilient Europe. Without further ado, I wish you all an inspiring webinar. Sam, over to you.
Thank you very much, Irina, for your opening address there. And just to echo the big welcome to all of our attendees tuning into today's event entitled, of course, Connectivity for a Gigabit Europe, brought to you by GIGAEurope, with the support of the Portuguese Presidency of the EU. And it is first to the Portuguese that we turn today before embarking on our panel discussion a bit later on. And for this cause, we're very pleased indeed to welcome Mr. Hugo Santos Mendes, Portugal's Deputy Minister for Communications, to the floor to deliver his keynote speech.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished leaders of the connectivity industry, thank you so much for inviting me to be with you. It is an honor to have the opportunity to share with you our views on the central topic of connectivity. As you may recall, last March, the European Commission launched the Digital Decade targets for 2030. The Presidency acted accordingly and promoted the signature of 3 declarations on Digital Day 2021. As we like to remember, the Portuguese Presidency is focused on making things happen. Time to deliver a fair, green, and digital recovery is our motto. That is why the topic of international connectivity has always been crucial in the digital agenda. And in our Presidency, we are making our best to devote special attention to it. The European Data Gateway Platform Strategy and the LLM cable are part of that effort. Today, It is well known that Europe's digital autonomy and global competitiveness depends on strong internal and external connectivity. Leveraging both dimensions is a condition for the European Union to become what it ambitions to be, the most attractive, secure, and dynamic data agile economy in the world. Yes, it is true that Europe has the real potential to become a world-class data hub, if it is able to make the best of its legal frameworks and quality internal infrastructure. But this is not the whole story. In fact, to reach its potential to the fullest, the European Union needs to be better connected to the rest of the world. For overall EU digital strategy to be effective, it needs to place the appropriate emphasis on international digital connectivity. Portugal fully supports the EU's drive towards becoming a global leader in the digital and data domain. Together, we are building not only a solid regulatory infrastructure, but also a high degree of trust among key stakeholders in the data sharing economy. Also, we must ensure Europe's policies on open strategic autonomy by building smart regulation. There is a broad support for the objective of promoting the flow of data in compliance with the EU's international commitments. The respect for EU values and principles, including privacy, security, and trust, are at its core. As such, it was an honor to see that during Digital Day 2021 in March, 26 member states, Norway and Iceland, signed the European Data Gateway's Ministerial Declaration. This commitment makes international connectivity as one of the key elements of the EU's 2030 digital decade. This effort calls on the European Commission to renew its focus on strengthening Europe's international connectivity through submarine cables and other connectivity solutions. And it is our conviction that our member states and the EU in general will benefit from this strategy. For example, in what concerns infrastructures such as submarine cables, EU must provide a clear message that these investments are not merely national projects, but essential tools for Europe to achieve its digital sovereignty. And if this is a priority, the funding should follow and be channeled into programs such as Connecting Europe facilities. I can also share with you that this initial signal has already produced positive and concrete actions that are in line with our call. In fact, the Commission has launched a study to map and assess the EU's international connectivity infrastructure. This effort is essential because to actually become a world-class data hub, Europe must invest in, promote its international connectivity via digital infrastructure projects. These connectivity networks around the EU that will ensure Europe's digital sovereignty can be viewed as 4 platforms: the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Baltic to Black Sea, and the North Sea and Arctic Ocean data gateway platforms. This plurality of platforms ensure that the balanced and strategic common-oriented EU approach towards international connectivity also safeguards the security and the geopolitical vision. Portugal intends to contribute to the EU Atlantic Data Gateway platform with the inauguration on June 2nd of the Ela-Link submarine cable during the Digital Assembly. What is Ela-Link? Ela-Link is a fiber optic submarine cable offering secure, high capacity and low latency connectivity between Europe and Latin America. This bears to be repeated. With state-of-the-art technology and reduced data distance, Ela-Link reduces latency by 50% compared to current infrastructure. This is the sort of investment that not only changes things marginally for the better, but can actually transform the way the two continents relate to each other in the digital dimension, not only to improve, to enhance, to ameliorate, but to transform. This is our ambition, and this is what Ela-Link promises to do. The Ela-Link cable comes from Fortaleza in Brazil, crosses the vast Atlantic Ocean, a distance of around 6,000 kilometers, and enters European territory via Sines in the Portuguese coast. It will then travel towards Lisbon, Madrid, and Marseille. Ela-Link represents the very real tie that will bring these continents closer together. It goes without saying that more initiatives of this kind would be most welcome. There is much to gain from connecting international cables between member states and from the EU in general to other parts of the world. It is easy to understand why. Personal and industrial data flows and international trade volumes in digital services will most likely grow exponentially, and competition and scale will most likely bring down costs. The bottom line then is that in order to become digital sovereign and to make autonomous technological choices, the EU must strengthen not only its internal connectivity, but also to empower its strategic international links. In a nutshell, Europe cannot become an island in the digital connected ocean. And that is why we must keep working together hard to contribute to set the European Union as a leader, a norm setter, and a global player in this increasingly digital connected world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hugo Santos Mendes, Portugal's Deputy Minister for Communications, pitching connectivity there as key to European digital sovereignty, and also raising some interesting points with regards to improving Europe's international connectivity infrastructure. Hugo referred there to, of course, L-Link, as well as the reliance said infrastructure has on the EU making the most out of its data ecosystem. We, of course, know that the European Commission last year presented its new data strategy, which aims to make the most out of industrial data. And how much does this rely on a robust connectivity landscape across the EU? Well, perhaps some of these points can be raised in our forthcoming panel discussion now, which will last around 40 minutes or so. And for this cause, we are very pleased indeed to be joined by Rita Wezenbeek, Director for DG Connect's Connectivity Unit in the European Commission. We also have Erzsebet Fitori, Group Head of EU Affairs and Relations at the Vodafone Group. And we have Robert Kolthek, Vice President for Regulation at Liberty Global. As always, you can also get involved with today's conversation by posing your own questions to the panel using the Q&A functionality on the platform, and we shall pick them up as they come through. And you can also get involved with the debate on Twitter by keeping an eye on the GIGAEurope account. So, without further ado, I think it's about time to hear from our panelists on today's subject for discussion. And perhaps we could first turn to the Commission's Rita Wezenbeek to get a bit of an idea and an overview as to the connectivity targets outlined in the Digital Compass benchmarks. And Rita, I wanted to ask here that, of course, we have this one concrete target for all European households to be covered by gigabit network, with all populated areas covered by 5G by 2030. And I just wonder what exactly needs to be done in order for targets such as these to be met. Rita. I believe you need to turn your, there we go.
Can you hear me? Yes,
Wonderful.
very good. The eternal song, no? In this pandemic, I'm mute. So, good afternoon. Thank you very much. Thank you for the very good question, and thank you for inviting me. So, what needs to be done to realize the 2030 gigabit connectivity targets? So, I think I would look at two angles to address that question. One is, of course, the element of financing and funding, and the other is the element of regulation, and what do we need to do to create a regulatory climate that is encouraging for this challenge. So I think maybe without further introduction, it's very good to already then, in the area of funding, highlight immediately the importance of the recovery and the resilience facility that has been created by the member states, and that has as one of its great flagships the need to ensure connectivity on the basis of very high capacity networks. So as you know, this is the fund of 750 billion euro that has been reserved by the member states for the recovery from the crisis. And as you also know, member states have been in the process, and most of them have already delivered on the national recovery plans. And we see that while not all the funding of the rollout can come from private investors, an important role is also there for public investors. we see that this can be filled, of course, by national funding, but also by European funding, and there's a prominent role for the RRF. Now, it's maybe good to signal that at the moment we are in a situation where I think more than 17 member states have already submitted their plans, and we are happy to note that about 2/3 of them allocate money of the RF fund to connectivity, and about half of them to the rollout of 5G. So that to us is a very positive development. Overall, it's a very positive development that the 20% that should be reserved for the digital transition under the RF fund seems to be realized, and even more than realized, in a number of member states. So that is reassuring, it's positive. And if you say what is needed to ensure the realization of this gigabit target in the digital decade, of course, the funding is a really important part. I can expand on funding. We have also the Connecting Europe facility, also other funds that play an important role. Maybe not to go too far in the details. What we see in the area of funding is also a very important role for the combination of private and public funding. So we feel that it is necessary, and it should be encouraged to use perhaps a combination of national and European funding, or under certain circumstances, the RF allows the combination of funds of a European nature. And we feel it should be warmly encouraged to use both public funding and private investment together. So that is the whole area of how to finance. Now, regulation, I don't know how far you want me to elaborate, but there, of course, I cannot but see the code, the electronic communications code, as a very important tool to encourage this acceleration and rollout of the very high capacity networks. I mean, to list a number of issues, one of the goals that has been added to the new code is the rollout of very high capacity networks. So that is an element. Also, the code has a number of elements that are aimed at facilitating the rollout by, for instance, encouraging co-investment, encouraging also wholesale-only investment models. And over the whole, it would be a good use of the code if the national regulatory authorities indeed use this new regulatory framework to see to it that it is actually applied in order to accelerate and facilitate the rollout of the networks. Now, one final point that I think we should never forget, and to us in my DG connectivity, my directorate connectivity, is very important. We also have what we call the connectivity toolbox that has been developed by the member states, and under which the member states are now in the process of submitting what we call roadmaps. And these roadmaps are a collection of methods and tools taken from the toolbox with which the member states in their individual country aim at accelerating and facilitating the rollout of the networks. And we feel that in particular also the combination of using the roadmaps for connectivity and using the reforms in the RRF plans can be a very powerful tool to help the rollout of the networks. Okay. So that was quite extensive, I think.
Thank you, Rita, for your opening remark. I just had one follow-up actually on the electronic communications code and radio spectrum frequency allocations, because obviously it appeared, at least towards the end of last year, that those deadlines were going to be missed. What's the current state of play at the moment? I mean, were those deadlines actually missed? And what's the Commission going to do to follow up on any infringements that have been made to the deadlines set out in the Electronic Communications Code's assignment of radio spectrum frequencies?
Well, we are right now assessing the situation, and I think you can. So indeed, there are a number of member states who have not yet lived up to the deadline of granting 5G spectrum. I mean, of course, there are 3 different bands in which this spectrum ought to be already issued, and we are assessing the situation. So I mean, we can divide the member states in groups there. I mean, there are member states who have completely justifiable reasons why they haven't been able to issue yet. There are also those who are quite far in the process of issuing. So there, it would seem to be a waste of energy to take action. But there are also some for who these reasons are less obvious. So there is indeed a big question mark whether we should not move on and take more serious action to encourage them to accelerate the issuing of spectrum.
And what sort of reasons have member states given for missing out on those deadlines? I mean, is it down to the COVID? Is it down to supply chains? What exactly?
Well, I can, for instance, mention a very clear situation as an illustration that is in the public domain. In the Netherlands, there is a court case in which an injunction procedure has been started in order to prevent the issuing of the spectrum. In such a circumstance, it's difficult to force a member state to issue. But it's these kinds of reasons, and of course also the COVID pandemic is a certain clarification. But since there's also a group of member states who have not been hindered by the pandemic, I mean, there's of course a limit to the extent to which this can count as a valid justification.
Okay, thanks, Rita. Erzsebet, I wanted to bring you in here, and bearing in mind these various obstacles to previous rollout targets or previous allocation targets for radio spectrum frequencies. How confident are you, Erzsebet, of these 2030 targets, and what obstacles do you envisage will appear in the future from the industry's point of view?
Thank you very much. First of all, let me say that we at Vodafone are extremely supportive of the 2030 targets. So we think that the 2030 targets are indeed the right ambition for Europe. And I think we need to learn from past lessons and ensure that these targets are not missed. There are in particular 4 points that I would like to emphasize, which could help achieve these targets by 2030. First of all, I think it is very important that Europe very clearly recognizes its starting point with regard to the connectivity targets. First of all, I think that the pandemic has really kind of highlighted that connectivity is a lifeline. It has been a lifeline for citizens, for businesses. And also with 5G being increasingly deployed, it is very clear that the modernization, digitalization of businesses will be highly dependent on this infrastructure. So first of all, I think we need to recognize that there is clearly a changed kind of role and change needs with regard to connectivity, the security, the quality, the resilience of the connectivity that we are looking for today, not only as citizens and consumers, but also as business end users, as SMEs, as farmers, as patients, have considerably changed. And with regard to this, I think there is a very important recommendation from our side with regard to the digital decade targets, which is that connectivity is kind of the foundational layer. It is the enabler of the achievement of the other targets. Without connectivity, you can't really use your digital skills. Without connectivity, you cannot really rely on digitalized public services. So we think that there is a need for kind of a sort of a sequencing and a recognition that connectivity is the enabler, the underlying foundation for the digital and also to a great extent the green transitions. The second starting point I think we absolutely need to be honest about is that there is a huge investment gap in Europe. In digital infrastructure. This investment gap has been growing over the last 5 to 10 years. Currently, the European Investment Bank estimates that there is a 42 billion euro per annum investment gap in digital infrastructure. So we need to address this very actively. And thirdly, we need to recognize the starting point that the EU is currently not in a leading position with regard to both gigabit and 5G networks. We only have 14% coverage of 5G networks according to the European Commission today. And to get to a level where all populated areas are covered is a real challenge. So I think first comes the recognition of where we are starting from. Secondly, I think it is very important that at the EU level, at the national level, we utilize all of the policy, regulatory, and financial tools at our disposal to drive this paradigm shift with regard to connectivity and ultimately crowd in private investments. And for this, we think that there are two things needed. One is a more holistic strategy for secure connectivity, which binds together the policy framework, the digital decade targets, the RRF industrial strategy into a holistic and coherent whole. And secondly, and very urgently, we need more targeted and pragmatic policy measures, which will ultimately actually crowd in private investments and give investor confidence to private investors. The third point is very important. Progress should be measured against the targets, and there should be course correction in case we are not on track, and the DESI index of the European Commission in an augmented form would be a good tool for this. And fourthly, we are very firm believers that these ambitious targets can only be reached in partnership between government, EU institutions, industry, citizens, SMEs, etc. Because to be very kind of faithful to Vodafone's new brand, together we can.
Okay, thanks very much for your comments there, Erzsebet. Robert, I'd like to turn to you and actually bring together some of what Erzsebet said with some of what Rita said at the beginning there. And we now know that 2/3 of the 17 member states that have submitted their recovery plans have cited connectivity as a priority for investment as part of the recovery plan, that is. But how much more important, or is it just as important to be considering here private investment streams as well as the public investment? Robert.
Well, thank you, Sam, and well, thank you for inviting me to the panel. Yes, I think it is. I think we strongly support the Commission's connectivity goals because we believe that gigabit connectivity drives growth in every part of the European economy and directly benefits the consumers. And the current pandemic recovery gives Europe the chance to emerge from the other side of the crisis to a more green, more digital and more competitive society. And to achieve the Commission's gigabit goals, investment is needed, lots of investment. And that requires a predictable, reliable and consistent regulatory environment, because where there's legal uncertainty, there's less appetite to invest. And of course, yes, there needs to be a balance between private investment and public investment. But I think, as Erzsebet already said, it is important that private investment is not crowded out by public investment. What we also see is that there are still some barriers existing across sectors between member states and regions. And the Commission identified a number of those that we agree to. And for example, there are inefficiencies in the deployment of networks, mainly due to legal and administrative burdens. For example, it's burdensome to get the permit. There are high fees, and also those conditions differ between the member states. We also see some inconsistency in regulatory approaches by the national authorities, which also makes it difficult, particularly for pan-European providers, to deal with the different authorities. And then there's also what Rita already referred to, the fragmented approach to spectrum assignment. And of course, there are good reasons for that. But it's something that Europe has to deal with. And therefore, we feel that it is very important that the Commission's digital program will build on the current legislation to incentivize connectivity. So the European Communications Code, which is based on the principles of proportionality, of appropriateness, but also technology neutrality, and had the broadband cost reductions directive that's currently being reviewed, which will reduce regulatory burden and red tape. I think that altogether is very important to get Europe moving forward.
Okay, thanks, Robert. Rita, I'd like to bring you back in here, and I know you've got a couple of questions yourself for our industry representatives today, and maybe you could use this opportunity to pose them. But I also wanted to ask you more generally, in terms of reaching these 2030 targets, what synergies are you looking to build further between the public and private sector? And what do you really want the private sector to do in order to meet these long-term targets?
Well, I think I can take that question on a very down-to-earth level. So, as you know, I mean, to focus again on so first of all, the private sector should do its regular work. So should continue to renew its networks, should continue to invest as it already does. So indeed, in addition, it's very important to find a balance between public and private funding. So indeed, to the extent that there's public funding, it is important to see whether partnerships are possible. For instance, through blending facilities, by using the EU funds in combination with private funds. And there are quite many possibilities for the private sector to work in cooperation with EU funding. And then if you talk about situations in which it is really not possible to have private funding, but it is necessary to have public financing, to take the RRF as an example, the member states have now been working since October on their national plans. I mean, the national plans to a large extent have been submitted. Hopefully they can soon be approved. And that means that we are entering into an implementation phase. And that would mean that there will, for instance, be calls for tender, so public procurement. So now it is important to make it work. And I would hope, for instance, that it also goes together with the BCOs in the member states, where the broadband competence offices can also work together with private players to make sure that they can get the fastest, most effective, most efficient implementation of the national plans. So I would encourage private operators to associate with member states to understand what is in the plans. I mean, how will this unfold over the coming 1, 2, 3 years, and see where their role is, so that they can actively participate in basically what should be this massive exercise to improve European connectivity.
Okay, thanks, Rita. Maybe I could bring in Erzsebet here to perhaps respond to some of your suggestions there. Erzsebet, what's your take here on mobile operators and representatives from the private sector more generally having this closer relationship, more of a collaborative relationship with member states in their future fulfillment of the recovery plans?
I fully agree. I fully agree already. Operators have been, speaking for Vodafone, Vodafone has been collaborating very closely throughout the pandemic with governments, with EU institutions, with hospitals, with schools, to actually take a very active role in making sure that the basic functioning of society and these public services can actually reach citizens. So we think we see this almost as sort of a continuation of this partnership. I think that with regard to the recovery and resilience facility, we see it as a genuinely once in a lifetime opportunity, but it's a once in a lifetime opportunity not only for Europe to recover and build back better, which is, I think, kind of one of its key objectives, but also, I think, to make longer term changes that will make the European societies and economy resilient. And basically, the way we see this is that there is a huge need for these national recovery plans, not only to look at how to recover, but also to include policy reforms which will build in both the incentives for private investment to accompany public investment, and also to build the long-term changes, structural changes that are necessary for the resilience factor. So we think that it has kind of this dual role, and of course this is not only in the national recovery plans, but I think it is extremely important that, as I said in my first point, that we have a very consistent and very holistic approach, so that when we look at what our targets are, we make sure that the RRF and the way in which money is allocated and the way in which it is implemented and the national policy reforms actually support the achievement of the new connectivity targets. And equally at the EU level, I think it is very important that we make adjustments to existing policy tools that help crowd in private investment. So I think that there is a paradigm shift here. As Robert said, it's very important that public investment does not crowd out private investment. I think that remains a cornerstone of state aid policy. But I think what's quite new is that we need to recognize our quite kind of bleak starting point with regard to the targets, and we have to make sure that we also crowd in private investment, both via the public funding as well as via the policy reforms.
Mm-hmm. And let's take that point a bit further, actually, maybe with Robert. So, of course, we're talking a lot about public-private investment here, Robert, and this is something you referred to earlier on, as did Rita. But how also can policy and regulation be leveraged to good effect in meeting these long-term 2030 targets? What's your take on this, and how can regulation best support these goals?
Well, thanks, Sam. I think that is important. I think, as Rita already said at the beginning of her, when she started, there is an important balance between, let's say, the investment climate and regulation. And I think to achieve the goals, the connectivity goals, it's more important than ever for member states to implement best practices and for accelerating the deployment of very high capacity networks, as outlined in the connectivity toolbox. But also they should legislate as efficient as possible. And that means that any regulatory intervention should be appropriate and proportionate, balancing clearly the benefits against cost and potential impact on investments and innovation. And I think that's going forward, that's really key. Because above all, legal certainty is instrumental to ensuring the continued investment and innovation in Europe. And simply put it, over-regulation or market making likely disincentivizes investment, putting the Commission's digital connectivity goals at risk. So again, I think it's very important to find the right balance between promoting investment and a balanced regulatory regime.
Thanks, Robert. Over-regulation disincentivizes investment. Is that something you agree with, Rita?
On a principle level, yes, certainly. But I think we have certainly made an effort in the code to try and avoid that. And, I mean, to pick up on what Robert was saying, I mean, there's now an element in the rules on co-investments where it is clearly said that the regular access seekers who are not the co-investors should only get access when the investment is further down the line and when there is an assessment made on the one hand the risk entailed by the co-investors, and the other hand the fact that of course that the access seekers benefit from the investment made by the co-investors. So this is a provision that has now clearly been called into life to make the balance between those who are investing and those who come in at a later point and only benefit from the investment. So there, I would say, basically, the provision is really good and has precisely the intention to stimulate co-investment in this case. And here we are entering into a new time in which the national regulators are called upon to apply this provision. And we, as the Commission, are going to be asked to see whether we agree with what they do from a European perspective. So in that sense, I think, I mean, we clearly all have the same intention, which is to avoid overregulation and to make it possible that those who choose to invest in this market also have the benefit of their investment. And that is, of course, not to say that we should, on the other hand, move too far in the scale and allow some kind of remonetization. I think we have a lot to protect in the European Union, where we have competition at services level, and we have, in spite of the debate that one can have, we have a really good offer to consumers for affordable prices, and that is something that is quite important to preserve. On the other hand, of course, while recognizing the interest of the industry to also survive in the long run.
Thanks, Rita. Robert, you're nodding your head there. Are you convinced?
No, yeah, I am convinced, because I think Rita is right. I think the new communications code is very instrumental to ensure a balanced regulatory environment. I think, for example, one of the other important things in the code is that, and now the promoting the rollout of very high capacity networks is an explicit goal when it comes to regulation. And so in the past, it was always about, okay, well, consumer interest, competition, etc. But now also it is about rolling out and then promoting very high capacity networks.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to turn to some of the questions coming in from our audience in a moment, but if I will just, if Rita, you'll allow me to indulge myself in another question to you. So something else that was referred to in the Digital Decade targets, however, slightly somewhat, were 6G ambitions. They were rather vague, but many in Brussels found it interesting that the Commission's already starting to work on this next generation connectivity. What can you tell us about the Commission's ambitions in the 6G field? And I mean, is it rather premature now to be talking about 6G when even on 5G we haven't really started to gain a foothold in Europe?
Yes, well, I would like to indeed see this in perspective. I mean, you're right to say that this certainly doesn't have a lot of prominence already in the communication, but it is signaled, for instance, in the context of technological neutrality. And I would say it's only logical if you're setting out your vision over the next 10 years. You have to acknowledge that, of course, 6G is around the corner and it will not go away. Now, if you look at other jurisdictions, the US, China, Korea, Japan, I think they are arguably certainly working very hard, if not also ahead of us in preparing their future in 6G, also for very valid political reasons, in order to gain technological leadership, keep technological leadership. So many also strategic considerations come into play. I think where is Europe in this sense? I mean, we also have very good reasons to certainly engage and invest already in 6G. I mean, we have to acknowledge the strategic importance. We want to maintain our leadership where we have it. And we also feel that these elements moving to 6G can have an important role, for instance, in the context of the Green Deal. Now, I think we need to recognize that it takes about 10 years to develop a new generation, if you look at early R&D to technical maturity. So it's high time that we acknowledge this. Indeed, there is strong competition at a global level. For us also, 6G could be an opportunity to fill in the missing bits of the value chain. Also, while we are moving to edge clouds, where we certainly want to have a European presence. And I think also, I mean, if you look at today's webinar, I mean, if we have that 10 years down the line, we could have it in the form of holograms, for instance, or we could have, I'm not sure that I look forward to it, but we could have also experiences in terms of smells, for instance, over the internet. Well, but I mean, this is the future and we want to play a role. Now, just to wrap this all up, does this mean that we want to already go on record with a strategy on 5G in the context of the digital policy program? I don't think so. The digital policy program that we will develop on the basis of the Compass communication will be very much focusing on governance. How do we work together with the member states to get to the targets that we want? It will have a prominent role for what we call the multi-vehicle projects, so the cross-border cooperations. But I'm not sure that this is the platform in which we want to go on record with a clear policy on 6G already. On the other hand, as I said, we can certainly not disregard it in the coming decades.
Thanks, Rita. Yeah, you've got me convinced on the future of virtual policy conferencing, but only if, of course, that is accompanied by a virtual glass of red wine, which is something that I'm sure we've all missed out on. Erzsebet, I wanted to bring you in on this point of digital sovereignty, because, I mean, as Rita says, you know, the R&D process takes at least 10 years. And actually, there is an argument to say that the Chinese made so much ground on 5G nearly over 2 decades ago, when they started to buy up the rare earth minerals required in various chipsets, gallium nitrate, etc. But when we're talking about the general subject of our competitiveness with other global jurisdictions, how important is connectivity to our sense of digital sovereignty?
Thank you. I think it's a very important question, and I think the very short answer is that connectivity is a cornerstone of digital sovereignty. Digital sovereignty, I think, is all about capacities and capabilities, and connectivity is one of these. Secure connectivity, to be precise, is one of the key pillars. So I think that actually ramping up our capacities and capabilities with regard to connectivity and ensuring that we indeed reach the digital decade targets, that we bring gigabit connectivity and 5G to all populated areas, the latest by 2030. I think it will be needed sooner than that, to be entirely honest, is very important. I also think that it is very important that we really utilize the opportunity of the recovery funds now, because we already know that connectivity is really hardest to deploy in rural areas, areas which are commercially not viable, which are remote. But 30% of the European Union's population lives in these rural areas. So it's 30% of Europeans who can be divided if we are not making the best use of recovery money to reach them now in the coming 1 to 3 years with gigabit and 5G connectivity. If you look at a big member state like Spain, Spain is, for example, has 28% of its businesses and 20% of its employment in these rural areas, which cannot be covered on a purely commercial basis. So I think that one key lesson, I guess, from the pandemic is that it has really put the into the limelight the digital divides that Europe is struggling with. And I think that the response to the pandemic, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, should be made, I think, to the best possible use to close these digital divides, both in terms of connectivity, which I think is the foundation, is really the key enabler of all the other digitalization efforts, but also equally importantly, we need to spend that money also on digitalization and digital skills.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Erzsebet. I'd like to bring in some of the questions from our audience now. And just to follow on, actually, from what Erzsebet was saying, Germany, specifically rural Germany, has often come under criticism for its lack of coverage and connectivity. And we have a question on this subject from Florian Stuerer. I do hope that I've pronounced your name right. It's rather difficult for an Englishman to get some of these surnames correct. From EU Strategy. And Florian asks, the Commission just approved German state aid to provide connectivity to peripheral areas. Is this the right way to ensure that all citizens are connected to step in across areas where mobile network operators do not have a business case? Rita, perhaps you would like to take that one on board.
Well, it's, of course, although it's not so easy, because this is, of course, the area of my colleagues now in DG competition. So I know that they have had a very careful look at this case. And Judging this on the basis of the regular state aid criteria, they have come to the conclusion that in this case, there was a market default, and it was good to address it in the way proposed by the German state, taking into account the conditions that were respected by the German state. So I would say in this case, and of course we don't have too many decisions in the mobile world in particular where state aid is accepted. But in this case, I know that after careful analysis, the conclusion was drawn that this was the right way to bring connectivity to the remote areas. So I would endorse my state aid colleagues here.
Okay, thanks, Rita. When we're talking about connecting remote areas, Erzsebet, I mean, this is something you just spoke about, but how can we make the case more and more for ensuring that Europe and these vast pockets of rural Europe doesn't get left behind? I mean, what are the long-term risks here to isolating more and more communities from next generation connectivity?
I think that the key risk is really that these areas actually kind of lose their lifelines. And we already see this, that some of the rural areas are depopulating. And then as a consequence of that, some of the basic services are being withdrawn from those areas. And of course, also that leads to the younger generations leaving, that leads to businesses leaving. Whereas, as I said, in a key example, a very significant part of employment opportunities and a very significant part of businesses are actually based in rural areas. So I think it is very important that we maintain, or rather than maintain, improve their productivity. We improve their conditions and bring also kind of smarter solutions like telemedicine, for example, via connecting these rural areas with 5G and gigabit connections. Does public funding have an important role to play? Absolutely, absolutely. So we think that basically without public funding, a lot of these rural areas are at a high risk of being further left behind. And I think with the new technologies being very often more expensive or less well tested in terms of business case than the previous technologies, there is a high risk that the digital divide will actually increase. So as we move from 4G to 5G, there is a high risk that the digital divide will actually increase, and it will be a larger proportion of businesses and citizens who will be left without 5G connectivity, and therefore their competitiveness and their productivity will be at risk. I think as the broadband state aid guidelines are being currently reviewed, I think it is very, very important that we take on board some of the key learnings from the pandemic. Also, we take into account that there have been new digital decade targets adopted, namely 5G and gigabit connectivity, and of course also the VHCN objective mentioned in the code. And whilst we maintain the principle that we shouldn't crowd out private investment, I think there is an increasing role for public funding, for recovery funding, for other financial instruments to actually crowd in private investment, especially in these areas which are not reachable with private investment alone.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks very much for your response there to that question, Erzsebet. I'd like to get in one more question from the audience before we turn back to the panelists to submit their closing statements. And we have a question here from Ioannis Markopoulos, who, and this is probably one for you, Rita, again. Could you please elaborate on EU and other financing tools that could assist fibre deployment from the private sector?
Let me not go into too technical details, but many EU funds, for instance, the CEF Digital Fund, but also in the context of the RF Fund, it is perfectly possible to work together with commercial banks and national, how do you call it, participatory banks to assemble the funding that is necessary for specific projects. So what we have is for instance, that even member states can then work on the basis of the same footing as the private investors, in which case you even stay out of the state aid area. But I mean, there can be combinations of funding, which can be helpful indeed to facilitate the rollout of the networks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Rita. We are rapidly running out of time, I'm afraid, and we're going to have to close things up very, very shortly indeed. But before we do, I'd like to turn things back to our panelists and ask them maybe to give us a short closing summary of their main points that they've tried to highlight today. Perhaps for this, we could first turn to Robert Kolthek, Vice President for Regulation at Liberty Global. Robert.
Thanks, Sam. Well, I think the pandemic really changed our society. And I think what is important is that the recovery from the pandemic gives now Europe the opportunity to emerge to a more green, more digital, more competitive society. I think that's really key. And their regulation is instrumental because that should support in the end the investments that are needed to get to that, let's call it New Europe.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us here this afternoon, Robert. Next up, we have the concluding remarks from Erzsebet Fitori, Group Head of EU Affairs and Relations at the Vodafone Group.
Thank you very much. I think that in conclusion, the digital decade targets, in particular with regard to connectivity, are the right ambition for Europe. They constitute a step change compared to previous targets. But it is very important to recognize our starting point, also to put at great use and utilize all policy, regulatory, and also financial tools in order to crowd in private investment, and that we get this done together.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Erzsebet Fitori, there for your concluding remarks. Now, we'd finally like to turn to Rita Wezenbeek, Director for DG Connect's Connectivity Unit in the European Commission.
Yes, well, to me, indeed, what we have been discussing, I would in particular highlight the need for the public and the private sector to work together, and the importance of, on the one hand, European and national funding, and on the other hand, a smart and effective application of the regulatory framework. Maybe one point that I didn't get round to noting yet, but I think is also really important. I mean, I think in the sector of electronic communication networks, the telecom sector, we're also a little bit on the threshold of a completely new time, partly under the influence of 5G, where things like cloud infrastructure, edge computing will be really important. I mean, we have highlighted those elements under the infrastructure window of the digital decade. And there we are also of the strong conviction that Europe will not play its role in these new areas where we want to be digitally sovereign if we don't have a performing and effective telecoms network structure. So it's not only for citizens, it's not only for the regular, let's say, communication services to businesses, but also to make these steps into the new elements of the digital decades, that it is of crucial importance to have a healthy and performing telecommunications infrastructure.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your concluding remarks there, Rita Wezenbeek, Director for DG Connect's Connectivity Unit in the European Commission. And that's all we've got time for now for this session, I'm afraid. A big thank you to all of our panelists for taking the time to join the discussion this afternoon. And thank you to all of you at home, of course, tuning in remotely for this session and for your contributions and questions too. Thank you to GIGAEurope also and the Portuguese Presidency of the EU for having us all. Stay tuned for more presidency events on the subject of connectivity in the near future, brought to you by GIGAEurope. The next one, of course, coming under the incoming Slovenian presidency. But thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you again in the not too distant future. Thank you.